Morning everyone, I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person today. We have two poorly boys, so I'm having to stay home with them this morning. But yes, I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but today we have a really exciting sort of next chapter in Daniel that we're going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at Daniel 3, and I've called this talk Faith in the Fire. And this chapter really is a story about three Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, how they defied the king's order to worship a golden statue, an idol that he had created, and as a result they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And it's the first time really that the spotlight's been on these three men rather than Daniel. In chapter 1 and 2 we've seen that along with Daniel they refused to be tempted by the Babylonian culture. They held fast to their identity as God's people, and God gave them learning, skills and wisdom. So today we're going to be looking at how we can grow faith under pressure, how we can grow faith when we walk through seasons of real challenge and trial. So that leads us to chapter 3, and it's quite a long story, so I'm just going to tell it in my own words and then I'll pull out some of the key Bible verses as we go through. So this is Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold about 27 meters high and 3 meters wide. And all the leading officials of Babylon, along with every people group and nation, were commanded to worship the statue when the music played. Anyone who didn't bow down would be thrown into the fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold. Then the king's officials told him how majestic he was, but also made him aware that there were certain Jews that he had promoted within the kingdom of Babylon that weren't obeying his command to worship the statue. And the king was furious. If you do not worship it, verse 15, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand, he says. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. It's fair to say that Nebuchadnezzar was just a little bit annoyed at this. It says he was filled with fury. The king had the furnace heated 7 times its usual heat, and his strongest soldiers tied them up and threw them into the furnace. And those soldiers who threw them in died because of the extreme heat. But to his amazement and astonishment, Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. So the king called the servants of the Most High God out of the fire, and everyone gathered around them. They saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The king then commands that any people, nation or language who worships any god other than the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego will be killed and their homes destroyed. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then the 3 men are promoted by the king. So I'm hoping that today, by having 3 really clear, slightly cheesy points, that this will help us remember today's talk. So we're going to be looking at faith in the fire, being refined in the fire, you can see where this is going, and freedom in the fire. So first up, we're going to be looking at faith in the fire. In chapter 3, we see Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego responding with amazing faith when King Nebuchadnezzar makes this statue, this idol, which is almost the same height as Christ the Redeemer statue in Brazil. Like, it is absolutely huge. And it's a bit like the statue in the King's Dream in chapter 2, but this time it's made entirely out of gold. And it's supposed to represent the king and his imperial power. But these 3 men refuse to worship the idol statue. And this story in Daniel chapter 3 is really closely linked to Daniel chapter 6, which we'll read about later, which is about Daniel and the lion's den. And both these chapters have the same pattern of Daniel or his friends refusing to worship the king as God, being persecuted for it, remaining faithful to God, and God rescuing them. So what do we even mean when we say faith? What do we mean when we're talking about faith, having faith? Well, if any of you know our eldest boy, Nathan, he is just sports mad. Like, he just loves snooker, rugby, cricket, curling, like you name it. He loves sport, but no sports person holds a place in his heart like Harry Kane. He loves a bit of Harry, and he just thinks Harry can do no wrong. So who's going to score the next goal, Nathan? Harry Kane. Who's going to make the next assist? Harry Kane. Who's going to make the next penalty? Harry Kane. It's always Harry Kane. His faith in Harry is completely unwavering. But faith in a biblical sense is so much more than just positive thinking or even like devotion. The Bible speaks about faith as a belief and a trust in God's saving power. And faith is a gift from God given to us. In Ephesians 2, it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God." And the faith we see these three men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, displaying is just remarkable. And the key verse really in the chapter is verse 16, where it says, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So how can we have faith like this under pressure? How can we have faith like these men? Well, the first thing we see is that they respond with real confidence, but also humility. See the first two responses they give the king. On one hand, they respond in confidence by saying that God is able and he will deliver them from the fire. But they also say that if he doesn't save them, they still won't bow down, which shows amazing humility. Their confidence is in God. It's not in their own knowledge of their circumstances or their own limited knowledge of God and his ways and his perfect plans. Humility really says, God, you know best, and I don't. I don't have the whole picture. I don't have all the answers. The faith that they had showed real trust in God's power to save them, and faith in his character, that he is still who he says he is, even if he didn't save them. So who or what is our faith in is an early question I want to ask us today. When the pressure points come, which can be so hard, how are we responding? Are we responding like these men with quiet confidence and faith, reminding ourselves of who God is and reading truth in his word to feed us? Are we humbly coming to God and saying, I don't understand why or what your plans are for me in this situation, but I know that you love me? Another way we can grow faith under pressure is in obedience. And sometimes growing in faith simply means taking the next step and just saying yes to what you know God's asking you to do in terms of just that next little step. And I know for me and Dave that has been our story. Often we just haven't had all the answers. We had no idea how anything was going to work out. We didn't know how we were going to make it through. And time again, we've just felt God's gentle leading of us in him saying, just say yes to this, say yes to this. Little by little, step by step, little steps of obedience. God's made a way through for us in some very difficult circumstances. And these three men, as they step obediently into the fire, refusing to compromise, they're not left alone in the fire. Another stands with them. But to his astonishment, Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Now, some say this was like an angel standing in the fire, but most commentators believe that this son of the gods was actually a physical appearance of the Lord Jesus. So when we step out in obedience, even though it's scary, even though we don't have all the answers, we are not left on our own. Jesus will always meet us there. He will always be with us. Another way we can grow faith under pressure is through prayer and worship. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refused to worship any god other than Yahweh. It would have been so much easier to have compromised just that one time and just bowed down and worshipped the idol he'd created. But when the heat was on, they still chose to worship God. And I think it's true to say that when we go through seasons of pressure in our lives, it really reveals our hearts and our true character. When we're struggling with different things, maybe a family member or long-term sickness, a work colleague that's really difficult, or parenting our kids, where do we go for help? Where do we go for wisdom? Daniel and his 3 friends knew how to pray and pursue God. When we're in a crisis moment, is getting to God our number one priority? Getting to him in prayer, talking to him about how we're feeling, how we're struggling, getting to him in worship, just releasing emotion and speaking out truth over ourselves. Sometimes in the mystery and hardships of my life, I found that the only thing I can do is worship. As one friend said once when he was going through a crisis, I'm worshipping messily. Another way I believe we can grow faith under pressure is knowing that we can be refined in the fire. So the Bible tells us plainly that we live in a broken world. We see brokenness all around us, but that was not God's original plan or design. He meant us to be in relationship with him, to know wholeness, to know healing, to be set free from our sin. And when we come to know Jesus, he transforms us completely from the inside out. And that's such a wonderful, amazing thing. It's such good news that is needed in this world of real brokenness. But following Jesus doesn't mean we then get removed from that brokenness. We're called back into a world that is in desperate need of him, and we face trials and we'll face pain. And the Bible says if we follow Jesus, we'll even know persecution. And Tim Keller, in his book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, helpfully just points out really how water and fire have often been used in the Bible to represent trials. So fire was a common image for pain or judgment and suffering. And Isaiah 43 verse 2 says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. And personally, for me, I know one of the most challenging seasons I've walked through was through a season of illness with our boys when they were very young, and went through some really difficult situations and a few different moments that I found very, very frightening and challenging. And a prophetic picture that someone gave me in that season really summed up what I was experiencing. And it was a picture of me standing on the beach, and a storm was coming in from the sea, and I was just getting battered by these waves, and they were just striking me over and over and over again. But I had my 2 small boys behind me, and I was trying to protect them, but we were up close to these really sharp rocks. And this year again has been another season of great trials for us as a family, with Dave's health, and it feels like we faced another big storm. And floods and fires in the Bible, they often represented like extreme hardship and pain. And the Bible speaks about when we go through the fire in this chapter, not if. Like dark valleys, hardships, crashing waters and trials, these are all to be expected. And the fiery furnace that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were thrown into, it was actually most likely a kiln, and that was used for making and forming and shaping bricks under intense heat and pressure. So when we walk through the fires of testing and trial, instead of the fire consuming us and destroying us, we can know that we can come through that season of testing refined, reshaped, remolded, strengthened, and more beautiful than before. There is purpose in our pain, and it will not be wasted. How then are we to respond when walking through a season like that, a season of real pressure and trial? I think many people see trials as something to avoid, pursue personal happiness above all things. When life gets tough, just get through it, insulate yourself from it. And I know I can see that in myself as well. If I'm not in a good place and I'm struggling with a real season of trial, I can just retreat and go into myself and try to self-protect myself. And I know that's a bit of a warning flag for me that I'm not dealing with the situation in the right way. The Bible teaches us that suffering can actually be for our good, and that our faith only really gets tested under pressure, like gold when it gets purified under intense heat. Our faith, our character gets refined when we walk through life's pressures, because under that heat, when that gold is under that intense heat, all the dirt and the muck rises up to the surface so it can be purified. None of this means that going through challenging times is nice or fun. When we go through challenging times, because we can have faith that God is using that trial to form us and to shape us. Although it's painful, we can have faith and we can trust that God is who he says he is, and that he's using all things for our good. That even being in the fire, we are safe, because that is where he is too. It says in Romans 5, we can rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, has been given to us. And I love that verse. It shows so beautifully how God can work through those seasons of real trial to bring us through to a place of real hope. And I love that verse references back to shame, because I think sometimes we can try and protect ourselves from what's going on. We can feel guilt, we can feel shame through the things that we're experiencing. But there is real hope, and there's real hope today that through God giving us his Holy Spirit, we can know freedom, and increasing, like, just knowing his love for us in those seasons. We will never be put to shame because he loves us. So freedom then in the fire, because we can know hope, as we've just read about in Romans 5. We can also know real freedom through going through trials. And I was really struck again when reading this story in Daniel 3 that I hadn't really thought about how Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego went into the fire tightly bound up. But in the fire, they were unbound. They were walking around freely. And when we start to look at the trials that we face in the light of how these men responded, I believe there is much freedom to be found. Because we do have a choice in how we respond to the hard seasons that we walk through. Responding in faith produces freedom. And I just want to go through a few quick things that we can know freedom from. So freedom from fear. We're not told in Daniel 3 what these men were feeling before they went into the furnace. Were they afraid, peaceful? But what we do see is them responding with real courage. And the command in the Bible that appears the most times is do not fear. Fear not. Don't be afraid. And it comes up around 365 times. And Psalm 23, this is the New Living Translation, reads, even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect me. So we can know freedom from fear in trials as we respond in faith, as we talk to God and tell him all our deepest sorrow and pain, as we worship and sing out and declare truth about who he is. I do believe these things can change our hearts, it changes our mindset, it changes our perspective, and it can change things spiritually in us and around us. Responding in courage means you need to stay close to God. It comes from that closeness, that intimacy with him, abiding in him, knowing his voice. So what situation are you needing courage to face? We can also know freedom from idols. Tim Keller really helpfully says in his book Counterfeit Gods, what is an idol? It is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. An idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel my life has meaning, then I know I'll have value, then I'll feel significant and secure. And that's really what idols are all about. Things like material possessions, status in a work role or another part of our identity, our children, sex, our phones. Idols are anything that take the place of God in our hearts. And I find that really challenging. Is there anything in my life that is more important to me than God? Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego wanted only to honour the Lord. No idol would ever take his place in their hearts, even if it meant dying for it. So can you identify any idols in your own heart? Something else I believe we can know freedom from is freedom from faking it. So I know sometimes when I've spoken to someone who I knew was going through a really, really challenging season and I've asked them how they were doing, they've kind of responded in like, yeah, I'm okay. You know, count it pure joy whenever you face trials of, you know, many kinds. And you can see their eyes sort of like twitching a bit and you can see they're probably just about holding on. But the truth is there is joy to be found in trials, but the joy isn't in the trial. The joy is Jesus with us in the flames. This frees us up to genuinely have joy, but also free to be real and honest when life is really, really tough. You can have joy as a Christian and be a complete and utter mess. Having joy in trials doesn't mean you suppress your sorrow, your tears and your grief. Just read 2 Corinthians 6, 3-10. It doesn't mean pushing down your emotions. Having joy does look like trusting Jesus, that your loss is not the final word. So do you think God is speaking to you about living with greater honesty and vulnerability? And what's stopping you from living like that? Lastly, freedom from disappointment. I think one of the most challenging aspects of walking through pain and suffering is dealing with disappointment when we don't understand why things have happened the way they have. And disappointment left unchecked can easily grow into bitterness and anger, and these things choke faith. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego went into the fire with just the clothes on their backs. And I think if I had had a choice, I would have been like, okay, I want a fire suit, I want a fire extinguisher, I want time to write a note to my loved ones. I think the washing's just finished, that should get hung out. Ooh, maybe I could take some marshmallows with me. Like, it does sound ridiculous, doesn't it, to try and put conditions on how we face trials. But I so often think we approach suffering in the same way. We think we know what the best outcome should be, what we need to do to get us through it, what is going to make us feel best through it, what's going to be best for others and ourselves. We try to protect ourselves, and then we question God when things don't go the way we planned it. And we all want to know why, but sometimes we won't know why this side of heaven. We won't know why we go through the things we go through. And the question, I believe, needs to change to who. Who says he will never leave you or forsake you? Who promises to walk through the fire with you? Who even sent his own son, who sent his son into the brokenness of this world to suffer and die for you? I shared a picture earlier about me on the beach with my boys facing the storm. And God kindly showed me that picture again when I was praying through some of those moments I'd faced with the boys. And he very kindly showed me that the picture had changed. The storm, the waves, the circumstances, everything was exactly the same. But he showed me that Jesus had been standing behind me with his hand on my shoulder the entire time. I thought I'd face those moments completely alone, but he showed me that Jesus had been with me, even though I couldn't see him, he was right behind me. And I was reminded of the verse, the Lord will go before you, the God of Israel will be your rear guard. That's Isaiah 52. So I didn't get an answer to my why question, but I did know that he was with me in the darkest moments of my pain and grief. So are you holding on to any disappointment today? To summarise, we know that there is freedom to be found in Jesus, in the good times and the times of challenge, but deeper freedom from fear, from disappointment, from faking it, only comes from having our faith refined and tested in the fire of trials. And I just felt like God spoke to me about people in the room who were going through a season of trial. I had a picture of a saucepan on the heat, and it was bubbling away really furiously, and the lid was like popping up and down, and it was about to boil over. And to me, that was an image of someone being under immense pressure, like you're feeling the heat, you're trying to keep a lid on it all. And I felt God gently say that you can come to him and tell him how you're really doing, that you can lift the lid with Jesus. He is a safe person to do that with. It doesn't mean that the heat will be turned down, but he's inviting you to have that burden lifted this morning. So I think in a minute Dave's going to come and help us just go through a bit of a response time. Maybe Roger could come up as well, because I know he's got a great song that we're going to sing in a minute. So just to say as I close, following Jesus doesn't mean we won't go through the fire of testing or suffering, but he invites us to face it with him. Jesus chose the ultimate fire on our behalf. When we deserve to be thrown into the fire and consumed, he willingly entered the fire. He died on the cross, so we don't need to be consumed, so we don't need to die. And that is our confidence today. Jesus was consumed, so we don't need to be. So we can know whatever trial we face, it will not destroy us, that God has plans to remold us and to form us in those situations. And even death is not the end. Our hope is in the one who holds eternity in his hands. And I'll finish with this lovely verse from Lamentations. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness.